Hi, it's Dr. Steve from Misericordia University. In today's class, let's continue looking at Piaget's stages of development. At our last in-person class meeting, we introduced Jean Piaget, and we indicated that Piaget described cognitive development in 4 distinct stages: sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and finally the formal operational stage. We looked at some key terminology related to Piaget: schemes, adaptation, assimilation, accommodation, and equilibration. We then went on to explore the first stage of Piaget, which is the sensory motor, and we indicated that this stage focuses on senses and movement, motor skills. And we pointed out that babies have inborn behaviors that are known as reflexes. Things like the grasp reflex, or if you hold a child above the ground, the step reflex, and so on. By the end of this stage, a child's movement changes from reflexive to purposeful. And we said that this on-purpose behavior really represents the first actual thinking that a child does. We also talked about object permanence, which is a child's understanding that even when an object goes out of their sight, like when a parent walks out of the room, they still exist outside of their vision. Now let's go on to explore some of his other stages. Piaget's second stage is known as the pre-operational stage, and children are in this stage from approximately ages 2 through 7. During this stage, young children start to think more symbolically, and they can start using signs and symbols to mentally represent objects. During this stage, not only their concept development, but also their language development just explodes. And children, we find, are very egocentric in this stage. For example, in Piaget's mountain task, if you picture a child sitting looking at a table where there are mountains and some other objects around, they just cannot conceive that somebody sitting across that table will see things differently than they do. They will assume that everybody sees the same thing as they do, and that's known as egocentrism. Let's briefly consider several terms that will describe the characteristics of children in the pre-operational stage. First, we've got 2 related terms. Centration refers to a child paying attention to only one aspect of a situation. And egocentrism is a situation where the child believes that everyone sees the world as he or she does. Think of that mountain task that we just described. So centration and egocentrism are very much related. Conservation means that the concept that certain properties of an object, like the weight and the volume, remain the same regardless of changes in other properties. So here's what we mean. An older child will realize that if you have a certain amount, let's say you have 1 cup of water or soda, and if you pour it into a different looking vessel, it's still 1 cup. But children in the pre-operational stage just don't compute that. If they see a taller but thinner glass, let's say, they'll think that maybe that is holding more water, even though you just you just showed them the water or the soda was poured from one vessel into the other, but they'll say, oh no, it's more now in the second vessel. The last term here is reversibility. And this is the ability of a child to change direction in thinking and return to the starting point. So let's say, for example, we talk to children, we say 7 plus 5 equals 12. Well, now if we say, let's start with 12 and let's take away 7, will they be able to produce that 5 again? In other words, could they reverse the thinking? That's known as reversibility. Please take a few moments to look at the videos that accompany this video, the links that I provide. The first video deals with egocentrism and centration, the second with conservation, and the third will demonstrate what reversibility is. After you finish viewing the video links that I provided, from the illustrations that are contained in those videos, it'll reinforce that conservation is a situation in which a preoperational stage child just cannot understand that a tall glass but a shorter, wider glass actually contain the same volume of liquid. You find that egocentrism is a belief that everybody sees the world as that child does, which is very much related to centration, which is a situation in which the child pays attention only to his or her one aspect of that situation. And finally, reversibility refers to the ability for a child to reverse their process of thinking. And we find that in preoperational stage children, they don't have that ability just yet. And because of that, that's why they cannot understand that the tall glass and the shorter, wider glass can actually contain the same volume. They can't reverse their thinking and put that liquid back in that original glass mentally in order to figure that out. In Piaget's third stage, it's called the concrete operational stage, which represents children from approximately age 7 through 11. We find that children, their thinking now has developed, so they're more logical, and now their sense of reversibility is not an issue. So now they don't have those conservation problems, for example, with the tall glass and the short glass. Now they can figure that out. They can respond to inferred reality versus perceived appearances. In other words, they can now form concepts and they see the relationships and they can even solve problems because of this capability in this stage. However, they have a limitation of they work best with things that they are already familiar with. During this third stage, we find that children have moved from egocentrism to more decentered thought. In other words, now they can start viewing different patterns and they can start to see the viewpoint of from another perspective. So for example, when they look at clouds and if they determine, oh, well, that looks like a rabbit or it looks like a bird or something of this nature, someone else can feel that it actually looks like a different object, different from what their views are. So it's decentered thought. They're not as egocentric. They start to realize that those other viewpoints are quite possible. And because of this, they can now do what-if projections about objects. They can draw a map to their house. So very symbolic activity. And they can begin to understand different events from the past. Here are some key terms dealing with this stage. First of all, we already introduced the idea of inferred reality. And by definition, that is seeing things in the context of other meanings. And we already saw that preoperational stage children cannot do that. Seriation is the ability for children to arrange things in some logical order. It could be from smallest to largest. And transivity. Transivity refers to the ability to infer a relationship between objects based on knowledge of their respective relationships with a third object. Well, let's see what that means. So when we look at arranging these leaves from smallest to largest, that's known as seriation. And if we give a child a question like Tom is taller than Becky. Now here I drew the picture, but we wouldn't provide that picture. Tom is taller than Becky. Becky is taller than Fred. Now how does Fred fit into that mix? Well, that involves some symbolic thought. That's known as transivity. Piaget's fourth and final development stage is called the formal operational stage, and that lasts from around age 11 through being an adult. During this stage, we find that children have cognitively developed to higher level abstract thinking. They can now look at hypothetical situations, and they can think about them and analyze them and talk about them. Students can now understand more complex and abstract concepts in subject domains such as math, science, and social studies. They can now abstractly think beyond what's right in front of them in a very concrete form. And this is why children at these ages can now be open to studying algebra and other complex forms of math. Prior to this, they would have had a very much difficulty trying to understand that. And they have the ability to reason what is not being experienced. In other words, something hypothetical. In observing and exploring the fourth concrete operational stage, Piaget came up with this pendulum problem. The idea is that students would be given a task to compare the motions of longer and shorter strings with lighter and heavier weights attached, and make a pendulum to determine what's the influence of weight, the length of the string, and the dropping point on the time it takes for pendulum to swing back and forth. Now, typically, children before the fourth stage are not able to perform this experiment very well. They will perform unsystematic approaches to this experiment, and they typically draw incorrect conclusions about which of these factors very directly influences how fast that pendulum is going to swing. To see this illustrated, please watch the extra video that I have provided a link for. To sum up, here you can see Piaget's stages of development in concise graphic form from verywellmind.com. To conclude, see if you can briefly describe the 4 stages in writing as you view this graphic. You can write this as your response to the first question in written module number 1. When we meet for our next in-person class session, we will pick up from here. We will review the stages and ensure that you understand them well. Thanks for watching, and see you in our next class.